In July 2015, the small town of Clarksdale, Mississippi, simmered under a relentless sun that scorched the earth, leaving the air thick and sticky with humidity. Layla Thompson, a 45-year-old woman with weary eyes and a determined stride, stepped into her new role as a correctional officer at the local maximum security prison. She had spent years married to Ray, a truck driver whose long hauls left her alone in their modest clapboard house perched along the muddy banks of the Yazoo River. The years of tending to the home had softened her frame, and the crisp new uniform clung a little too snugly to her body, betraying the passage of time. She adjusted the stiff collar as she crossed the prison yard, her boots crunching against the gravel, the heat rising in waves from the ground. The prison loomed ahead, a squat fortress of gray concrete surrounded by coils of razor wire that glinted menacingly in the sunlight. Inside, the warden, Henry Crawford, awaited her, a hulking figure with graying temples and a stern demeanor etched into his withered face. He led her through a dimly lit corridor, the walls peeling with cracked paint, the air heavy with the scent of disinfectant and sweat. His heavy footsteps echoed as he outlined the rules with a voice that brooked no argument, no leniency, no mistakes. Layla followed silently, her eyes tracing the rusted pipes overhead and the flickering fluorescent lights that cast long shadows along the floor. They reached the second tier of Block D, a narrow passageway lined with solitary cells, each a small box of steel and concrete. The silence here was oppressive, broken only by the occasional clank of metal or the distant hum of a fan struggling against the heat. Henry handed her a ring of keys and a worn electronic pass, explaining her duties with a curt nod before turning back down the stairs. Layla stood alone, the weight of the keys pressing into her palm, and began her slow walk along the row of cells. The inmates inside remained still, their presence marked only by the faint rustle of pages or the shuffle of feet against the floor. At cell 208, she paused. Through the small observation window, she caught sight of Jason Perry, a tall man seated on his bunk. His hands moved with purpose, a pencil scratching across a scrap of paper, while a neat stack of books rested on the metal table beside him. His posture was relaxed, almost contemplative, and he didn't look up as she lingered outside. The faint lines of his sketch, a curve of a riverbank, perhaps, caught her eye, and something about his quiet focus stirred an unfamiliar pang within her. She adjusted her grip on the keys and moved on, her steps deliberate, though her mind lingered on the man behind the bars. That night, back in her quiet home, Layla lay in bed, the ceiling fan spinning lazily overhead. Ray was gone again, his side of the mattress cold and untouched, the faint rumble of his last departure still echoing in her memory. The house creaked softly, settling into the humid night, while the river murmured beyond the thin walls. She stared into the darkness, her thoughts drifting back to the prison, to the man in cell 208. His calm presence gnawed at her, a puzzle she couldn't place. She turned onto her side, the sheets clinging to her skin, and wondered why, of all the faces she'd seen that day, his was the one that stayed with her as sleep refused to come. Layla settled into the prison's rhythm with surprising ease, her days unfolding in a steady cycle of morning rounds, tray deliveries, and long shifts pacing the echoing corridors of Block D. The clatter of keys and the metallic clang of cell doors became as familiar as the hum of the river outside her home. Ray's calls grew sporadic, his voice crackling through the phone only once every few weeks, leaving her world narrowed to the gray walls of the prison and the silence of their house. In the quiet moments between duties, her curiosity drew her to the filing room, where she pulled Jason Perry's file from a dusty cabinet. The pages revealed a man who defied her expectations, a former schoolteacher from Jackson, educated at a community college, once known for mentoring kids in underfunded schools. 7 years prior, he'd been convicted of robbing a gas station at gunpoint, a botched heist that ended with a cashier's death. The stark contrast between his past and his crime ignited a flicker of intrigue in her, a question she couldn't shake. She volunteered for shifts in the prison library, a cramped room tucked in the basement with sagging shelves and a single barred window letting in slivers of dusty light. It was there that her path crossed Jason's with regularity. He'd appear on designated days, his tall frame moving with a quiet grace as he browsed the worn collection. He favored books on art and history, his fingers lingering over faded covers before selecting one to carry back to his cell. She noticed the pencil marks he left in the margins, delicate sketches of bridges or trees, sometimes a few scribbled words. During her rounds, she began pausing at cell 208, watching through the window as he bent over his drawings. Soon, she found excuses to linger, asking about the books he read or the sketches he made. He spoke of New Orleans galleries he'd visited in another life, describing the vibrant chaos of the French Quarter and the earthy scent of the Mississippi Delta after rain. His voice carried a wistful edge, a longing that seeped into her own restless thoughts. Their interactions grew tentative but charged. When she slid pencils or paper through the slot in his cell door, their fingers brushed, brief, accidental touches that sent a jolt through her, stirring something dormant beneath the weight of her years with Ray. The warmth of those moments lingered on her skin long after she returned to her post. She started spending more time in the library, her boots scuffing the worn linoleum as she watched him from the corner of her eye. He'd look up from his reading, meeting her gaze with a calm intensity that made her breath catch. The prison psychologist, Esther Wilson, a gray-haired woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense air, took note of Layla's frequent presence in the basement. One afternoon, as Layla sorted returned books, Esther approached her near the shelves, her shadow falling across the table. She cautioned Layla about the invisible lines that separated guards from inmates, her tone firm but tinged with concern. Layla brushed it off with a shrug, insisting it was just a preference for the quiet duty, but the words stuck with her, prickling at the edges of her mind. Alone that night, she traced the memory of Jason's voice, feeling a restless energy awaken within her, something she hadn't known she'd buried. By the time autumn settled over Clarksdale, the air had cooled slightly, but the humidity lingered, wrapping the prison in a damp embrace. Layla's connection with Jason deepened, threading its way into the fabric of her days like a secret she couldn't unravel. She began slipping into town on her days off, picking up old art magazines from a second-hand shop near the riverfront. She'd tuck them under her jacket, smuggling them past the prison gates to pass to Jason during her library shifts. In return, he left her notes, scraps of paper folded into tight squares, filled with lines of poetry about the river's slow churn or the golden haze of a Mississippi sunset. She'd slide them into the pocket of her uniform, her fingers brushing the creased edges as she walked the corridors, later unfolding them in the dim light of her bedroom when Ray was away. Their encounters in the library grew bolder. One evening, as the prison settled into the quiet hum of lockdown, Layla lingered under the pretense of checking the shelves. The room was still, the only sound the faint creak of the building and the distant clang of a door shutting somewhere above. Jason stepped closer, his shadow falling across the faded linoleum, and she felt the heat of his breath against her neck. She didn't pull away. Their lips met, tentative at first, then urgent, and the space between them dissolved. In the narrow gap behind the stacks, where dust muted the world beyond, his hands found her back, tugging at the buttons of her uniform until the fabric fell away. Her skin pressed against his, the roughness of his prison garb a stark contrast to her softness, and for those fleeting minutes, she forgot Ray, the rules, the life she'd built. She surrendered to the rush, her pulse pounding as if she'd woken from a decades-long sleep, alive in a way she hadn't been since her youth. After that night, their meetings became a hidden ritual. Stolen kisses punctuated her rounds, their hands brushing in fleeting moments when no one watched. She forged entries in the library log, scribbling fictitious names to mask his visits, her pen moving with practiced care. Jason's requests crept into their exchanges, small favors at first, like passing a folded note to a man in Block C or leaving the supply closet door ajar during her shift. She complied, her judgment clouded by the pull she felt toward him, each act binding her tighter to his orbit. Esther Wilson, the prison psychologist, caught the shift in her demeanor. During a chance encounter in the staff room, the older woman's keen eyes lingered on Layla's fidgeting hands and the distracted way she carried herself. Esther's warning came sharp and clear, a reminder of the dangers lurking in blurred boundaries, but Layla waved it off with a tight smile, insisting nothing was amiss. The illusion held until November, when word came that Jason's petition for a case review had been denied. His calm fractured, replaced by a simmering edge she hadn't seen before. One afternoon, in the library's dim corner, he pulled a contraband phone from his sleeve, its screen flickering with photos of them, grainy shots of their closeness, captured in secret. His demand followed: she'd help him escape, or he'd send the images to the warden. The weight of his words crashed against her, splintering the fragile world she'd built around their stolen moments. She stood frozen, the air thick with betrayal, as the life she'd known began to crack beneath her feet. The tension coiled tighter with each passing day, a noose tightening around Layla's chest. Jason had laid out his escape plan with chilling precision: a bribe to sway the guard in the East Tower, a route through the storage warehouse, and a sprint to a gap in the outer fence he'd scouted during yard time. He dangled the photos from his illicit phone like a weapon, his threats slicing through the fragile trust she'd placed in him. If she refused, he'd send the images to the warden, exposing their affair and shattering her life. His words turned cruel, branding her a naive fool, a pawn valuable only for what she could do for him. Her heart churned with a bitter mix of love and rage, each beat a reminder of the betrayal she couldn't unsee. At home, Ray remained oblivious, lost in the grind of his trucking routes, his absence leaving her to wrestle with her turmoil alone. On December 15th, the air in Clarksdale hung heavy with moisture, a gray drizzle streaking the prison's concrete walls. Jason worked the late shift in the warehouse, a cavernous space cluttered with crates and shelves, sorting supplies under the flickering glow of overhead bulbs. Layla entered under the guise of a routine inspection, her boots echoing against the damp floor. The room smelled of mildew and motor oil, the humidity pressing against her skin as she moved past stacks of boxes. Jason stood near the back, his hands shifting cardboard with a casual rhythm, but his posture stiffened when he sensed her approach. He turned, his eyes glinting with a mocking edge, and tossed a barb about her usefulness, his voice low and cutting. The words landed like a spark on dry tinder, igniting something feral within her. Her gaze fell on a metal pipe resting on a nearby shelf, its surface dulled by rust but heavy with promise. She reached for it, her fingers closing around the cold steel, and in that moment, reason slipped away. The first blow struck his skull with a sickening thud, a spray of blood arcing through the air as he staggered. He didn't have time to react before the second swing followed, then a third, her arms moving with a blind, unrelenting fury. The pipe rose and fell, each impact a release of the pain he'd sown, until he crumpled to the floor, a lifeless heap amid the shadows. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and glossy against the concrete, seeping into the cracks like spilled ink. Layla stood over him, chest heaving, the pipe slick in her trembling hands. Reality crashed back in jagged pieces, and she dropped to her knees, wiping the weapon clean with a rag from the shelf. She returned it to its place with deliberate care, aligning it as if it had never moved. Her mind raced, piecing together a cover. She pulled the logbook from her pocket, her pen scratching out an entry that placed Travis Lloyd, a volatile inmate known for his temper, in the warehouse at the time of the shift. The forgery was meticulous, her handwriting steady despite the tremor in her limbs. She slipped out, locking the door behind her, and returned to her post as if nothing had changed. An hour later, a guard's shout pierced the silence, followed by a chorus of yells and the wail of sirens as the prison erupted into chaos, the discovery of Jason's body sending shockwaves through the night. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Detective Owen Reed pulled into Clarksdale, his old sedan rattling over the uneven road that skirted the prison's outer fence. He stepped out, adjusting the brim of his faded fedora, his lean frame casting a long shadow across the gravel. The air carried the damp weight of the river, mingling with the faint tang of diesel from a passing truck. He flashed his badge at the gate, his sharp eyes scanning the guard towers as he made his way to the warehouse where Jason Perry's life had ended. The crime scene had been cordoned off, a strip of yellow tape fluttering in the breeze, and he ducked beneath it, his boots scuffing the concrete floor. The blood had dried into a dark, irregular patch, its edges curling inward like a map of some forgotten territory. He knelt beside the shelf, his fingers hovering over the metal pipe that rested there, its surface wiped clean and positioned with an almost unnatural precision. The tidiness struck him as odd, a killer's care that didn't fit the chaos of a sudden brawl. He rose, dusting his hands on his trousers, and turned his attention to the security logs, flipping through pages until he confirmed what he'd suspected. The cameras had gone dark hours before the murder, down by a glitch no one seemed able to explain. Owen tracked down Travis Lloyd next, finding him in a holding cell near Block C. The inmate sat with his broad shoulders hunched, his hands resting on the table, exuding a quiet certainty as he dismissed any involvement. Owen studied him, noting the steady set of his jaw, and later confirmed his alibi with two cellmates who swore Travis had been playing cards with them when the killing occurred. Their accounts matched too perfectly to be rehearsed, leaving Owen with an itch he couldn't scratch. He returned to the warehouse, pacing its length, his gaze darting from the bloodstain to the shelves, then up to the blank eyes of the dead cameras. The scene felt staged, a puzzle with pieces forced into place, and he resolved to widen his search. He headed to the records room, a windowless space where the air hung stale and thick with the scent of mildew. He pulled Jason's file from a dented cabinet, spreading its contents across a desk littered with coffee rings. The pages chronicled a life that had veered off course, a teacher from Jackson, a man who'd once graded papers and coached basketball, now reduced to a 7-year sentence for a robbery gone wrong. Owen lingered over the details, the gas station, the panicked shot that killed the cashier, searching for a thread that might explain his death, but nothing jumped out. He moved on to Jason's cell, a narrow box of concrete and steel, and lifted the thin mattress with a grunt. Beneath it lay a small trove of papers, folded tightly and tucked against the frame. He unfolded them one by one, revealing poems in a flowing, feminine script, verses about riverbanks and twilight, paired with pencil sketches of bridges and faces. The handwriting was meticulous, the work of someone who'd poured herself into each line, and it set his mind racing. He sought out Esther Wilson later that afternoon, finding her in her office, a cramped nook lined with bookshelves and yellowing files. She sat behind her desk, her silver hair pulled into a tight bun, her glasses perched low on her nose as she sorted through notes. Owen leaned against the doorframe, his hat tipped back, and listened as she recounted her observations. Layla Thompson had shifted over the past months, she said, her hands fidgeted more, her eyes darted during breaks, and her time in the library had spiked to an unusual degree. Esther's voice carried a note of concern, though she admitted she'd never pinned down anything solid enough to report. Owen nodded, filing away her words, his thoughts circling back to those handwritten notes. He called Layla in for questioning that evening, meeting her in the staff room where a single bulb buzzed overhead. She sat across from him, her uniform pressed but her posture tense, her fingers twisting the cuff of her sleeve as he flipped open his notebook. He asked about her shifts, her rounds, her time with Jason, his tone even but probing. She answered with a practiced calm, her voice smooth as polished stone, but he caught the faint tremor in her hands, the way her gaze slid away when he mentioned the library. Her composure felt like a veneer, thin and brittle, and he let her go with a curt nod, already piecing together his next move. Back in the records room, he pulled the warehouse log, laying it beside the notes from Jason's cell. He traced the lines with a finger, comparing the loops and slants. The handwriting was identical, a damning link between the forgery and the secret correspondence. The camera failure gnawed at him still. He cornered the maintenance crew, who shrugged and muttered about faulty wiring, their vagueness only deepening his suspicion. Night fell, and Owen retreated to his motel room on the outskirts of town, a squat building with peeling paint and a flickering vacancy sign. He tossed his hat onto a chair and spread his evidence across the bed, the logbook with its falsified entry, the stack of poems and drawings, a timeline of Layla's shifts. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling toward the ceiling, and stared at the mess, letting it settle in his mind. The affair was clear. Those notes screamed intimacy, a bond that had spiraled beyond control. Jason's death, timed too neatly after the camera crash, pointed to desperation, maybe a lover's quarrel turned lethal. He pictured Layla in the warehouse, her hands on that pipe, driven by fear or betrayal after Jason pushed too far. The pieces fit, but not perfectly, and that kept him restless. He stubbed out the cigarette, the ashtray overflowing, and slipped the notes into his jacket pocket. Tomorrow, he'd bring her in again, lay those papers out like a trap, and watch her story unravel under their weight. The river murmured outside, its sound seeping through the cracked window, a quiet witness to the tangle he was determined to unpick. The interrogation room was a stark cube of concrete, its walls stained with years of damp and neglect, the air heavy with the tang of rust and sweat. Owen sat across from Layla, his chair scraping the floor as he settled in, his notebook open and his fedora resting on the table's edge. He laid out the notes from Jason's cell in a deliberate row, their creased edges curling slightly under the harsh light of the overhead bulb. Each one bore dates that aligned with her library shifts, a silent map of her entanglement with the dead man. Layla sat motionless at first, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the papers as if they might vanish if she stared hard enough. Owen began his questions, his voice steady but unrelenting, each one a chisel chipping away at her silence. She held out for a time, her lips pressed into a thin line, but the weight of his persistence bore down until cracks appeared. Her confession came in halting bursts. She'd fallen for Jason, swallowed his promises of a fresh start beyond Clarksdale's suffocating grip, only to find herself cornered by his blackmail when he demanded her help to escape. The swing of the pipe had been a flash of rage, a moment where control slipped through her fingers, but the aftermath, wiping it clean, framing Travis, had been calculated, a desperate bid to claw her way out of the mess. When she finished, her voice trailed into a whisper, and Owen signaled the guards. They stepped forward, their shadows looming as they cuffed her wrists, the metal clicking shut with a cold finality. She shuffled out, her head bowed, while outside the wind stirred the dust along the Yazoo River's banks, a restless murmur against the stillness. The trial convened in Jackson, a 2-hour drive south, in a courthouse where the wooden benches creaked under the weight of onlookers and the air hummed with the drone of ancient fans. Layla sat in the defendant's box, her prison-issued gray dress hanging loose over her frame, her posture still carrying the rigid echo of her guard days. The prosecution called her former colleagues one by one, men and women she'd once shared coffee with in the break room. They testified to her odd behavior in the months leading up to the murder, her clipped responses, her distracted stares, the way she'd linger near the library when her shift should have ended. Esther Wilson took the stand next, her silver hair glinting under the courtroom lights as she spoke of Layla's obsession, a slow spiral she'd watched unfold but couldn't stop. Her testimony was careful, measured, painting a portrait of a woman consumed by something she couldn't name. Owen followed, his evidence laid out like a hunter's trophies, the forged logbook, the stash of poems and sketches, the grainy photos from Jason's phone that captured stolen moments in shadowed corners. The jury absorbed it all, their faces unreadable, and after a deliberation that lasted barely 6 hours, they returned with a guilty verdict. The judge delivered the sentence, 20 years in a maximum security facility, his voice flat, the gavel's strike reverberating through the room like a door slamming shut. Layla was transferred to a women's prison in Alabama, a sprawling complex of red brick and razor wire nestled in a pine-thick valley far from the river she'd known. The days there blurred into a gray routine of cell checks and silent meals, the clang of gates marking time's slow crawl. A month into her sentence, a medical exam revealed a truth she'd only half suspected. She was pregnant, the child Jason's, conceived in those reckless moments behind the library shelves. She sat on her bunk that night, her hand resting on her still flat stomach, feeling the first faint flutters of life beneath her skin. She told no one, guarding the secret like a fragile ember, a piece of him she carried into her exile. Word of her downfall reached Ray through a curt letter from her court-appointed attorney. He didn't call or visit. Instead, divorce papers arrived weeks later, his signature scrawled in a hasty slant, severing their marriage as cleanly as a knife through thread. She signed them without hesitation, her pen steady, and sent them back, the last tie to her old life dissolving into the ether. In Clarksdale, Layla's story took on a life of its own, spreading through the prison like wildfire. Guards swapped tales over cigarettes in the yard, their voices low as they recounted her fall, a warning carved into the institution's memory about the dangers of letting the heart stray too close to the bars. It grew into a legend, a ghost story for new hires, whispered in the flickering light of the staff room. Owen lingered on the case longer than most, returning to his motel room on quiet nights to pore over his notes. He'd sit at the wobbly desk, a bottle of cheap whiskey at his elbow, flipping through photos and statements, tracing the path from library glances to a blood-soaked warehouse. He wondered where the tipping point had been, what moment had pushed her from love to murder, but the answer eluded him, slipping through his fingers like river silt. He'd drive out to the prison sometimes, staring at its silhouette against the sunset, feeling the weight of an unfinished puzzle. In Jason's old cell, a new inmate moved in, a wiry man with restless hands who pried loose a corner of the wall panel during a sleepless night. He found a single sketch tucked inside, a pencil drawing of the Yazoo River, its curves soft and flowing, the banks shaded with a gentle hand. He turned it over, tracing the lines, but the guards confiscated it during a routine sweep, tossing it into a cardboard box in the evidence room. It sat there, buried beneath stacks of yellowing files, forgotten as the years crept on, a final whisper of a passion that had flared bright and brief before fading into the humid haze of Mississippi's endless summer.